It is Thursday, November 1st, 2018, and this is the MMA Beat. Welcome, everyone. I'm the host of this program. My name is Luke Thomas. I'm from SiriusXM as well as MMAfighting.com. To my left is, you know all these gentlemen, but I think this is the first time we've had this arrangement, so this should be kind of interesting. Nice. To my left is the man with the plan. That is Danny Segura. He is from MMAfighting.com. Mark Ramundi came back to New York like all New Yorkers actually do. He's from MMAfighting.com. You know him as well. And at the end, the man in the hat from The Ringer, as well as MMAfighting.com, Chuck Mindenhall. All right, boys. Welcome back to New York, sir.
It's good to be here. It's cold in New York.
Dude,
in an apartment, man. You've been out here a bunch in the last few months here.
I have an Airbnb right now, and my Airbnb is it's a 5th floor walk-up.
Ooh, that's always fun.
And it's a winding staircase, and the staircase is just like barren and broken.
This is true.
So I promise I may not. Hopefully, I can make it to media day.
It's $4,000 a month. For true story, when I first moved to New York, I moved to a 6th floor walk-up, which is legally the limit they can put in without an elevator. But you had to walk up a floor to get to the first floor, so it was technically illegal. Great. All right,
it should probably be illegal.
It's 100% illegal. Anyway, forget all that. We got tons of MMA to get to. I don't want to waste another moment. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Now, we're having to not do this live like we normally do because we got duties to get to. So there is no after the beat portion, but I just want to make a mention. Please keep sending us any questions or any comments you might have using the hashtag, the MMA Beat. We will make sure we do a big, long one the next time we do one of those. But we have to get right to it. UFC 230 now. Boy, just a couple of days away. Mark, since you are our esteemed guest, I'll go to you first on this one. And you were on the left coast. Now you're back to this one. A lot of questions I want to ask about 230. The first one is, of course, what you feel might be the buzz. We're still, a couple days out. You went to the open workouts yesterday. Give me a sense of what the crowd was like there. Give me a sense overall of what you think the buzz is.
So open workouts on Wednesday was, I would say the enthusiasm was a bit tempered. It was not a huge crowd. It was, first of all, even for past MSG workouts, it's just a hard sell to get New Yorkers to come out in the middle of the day. Even when Conor McGregor was working out, there wasn't, you guys were all at that. There wasn't a huge crowd.
It was decent.
It was decent, but it wasn't like a crowd that you would imagine Conor McGregor getting in Las Vegas or really anywhere else. Middle of the day, New York City, it's just a hard sell. Wednesday was also Halloween, so people were doing other stuff. So it was a little bit quiet at open workouts, but it was fine. And even you could tell also that no one really did a long workout. No one was really feeding off the crowd because there really wasn't that energy to feed off of. So it was just kind of a quiet, regular open workout. It did not feel like a big event open workout.
And generally speaking, the buzz, what do you think?
It's so hard to say at this juncture because we're not quite at weigh-ins yet where there are fans who are already there and they're not at work and they're actually at the event to have fun. I'm not sure yet. I'm not feeling much of a buzz right now in New York City. New York is a hard nut to crack. You have to come correct for New York. You really do. I mean, not saying that Cormier versus Lewis is not an interesting fight. It's a fascinating fight. I think it's a good UFC main event, but it isn't the kind of main event that they brought to MSG in the past, and I think that could be hurting it a little bit. If you're going to go to an MSG show, you're expecting McGregor.
Well, that's what they promised, right? That was promising. Well, if we come to MSG, we're going to come correct. And I think that this particular one, and we've watched them put this together, and we know that it was this close to actually being something far worse, probably. So they were able to kind of salvage a little bit more with this, with the top fight, the heavyweight championship. But ultimately, I haven't really felt much buzz in the city. I don't know. It's hard to gauge, obviously, because this is a big city and there's a million people running around. But I can tell you one thing. When the Irish are here, you certainly know it, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere, and you see people just, everywhere you go, there's somebody talking about McGregor or something like that. This time, with no Conor McGregor on the card, it does seem a little bereft.
What about you, Danny? You live here.
Yeah, well, I didn't go to the open workouts, so I didn't get to gauge that. But from what I've seen, not much of a buzz. I think, fans are a little bit emotionally drained out of all the drama that happened from UFC 229. And then on top of that, this card was originally scheduled to be really an MSG card. It felt big. There was tons of good fights, but they've been dropping out left and right. Originally we had Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier in there, and that's one of the best fights of the year, period. One of the best bookings. And, that's no longer there. And this main event, although it was a fine fight, like Mark Ramundi mentioned, it's still a fight that felt that it was sort of just putting together last minute just out of necessity rather than, a fight that naturally came organically. And, that's always, not good. So
That's why I feel like it's unfair to Derrick Lewis because Derrick Lewis has won 9 of his last 10. If there's no Brock Lesnar or whatever else is happening, you could have done the rematch with Stipe, but there is a case to be made meritocratically that Derrick Lewis is a perfectly serviceable contender 100%. For that title shot. But in the way that they make it, it undercuts that very fact, which is sort of like an unfortunate aspect
They make it out of necessity, like you mentioned. And also, we just watched Derrick Lewis in a war, basically, where he was getting pieced up for the bulk of the fight and nails a Hail Mary at the end to win it. That's the only reason he's in his position. So we're watching it almost through our fingers a little bit, like, dude, he's not even medically cleared, and here he is doing this. It started off on a very wobbly foot, and therefore, I don't think you can get behind. Like, it was tough to get behind it. It was so left field, and there was those kinds of questions with it. It's only right now that you start to get kind of excited about what Derrick Lewis, especially when he starts to talk and you get his personality involved a little more. I think we'll get a little more warm to the idea, but ultimately, right now, it's still in that phase of how did we get here?
Yeah, two quick points I would make. People ask, like, how do you know if there's buzz? Well, you just kind of run into it. You can't really avoid it. A point I made when I came here for UFC 205, Penn Station, the Amtrak station, is literally right below MSG. They're right on top of each other. And I remember I got my bags off the train and I walked out onto 7th Avenue and there were McGregor signs lit up everywhere. I mean, you couldn't miss it. Like, it smacked you right in the face. And that's one way. I will say, when I look at the ticket sales today, they're still not, trust me, they're far from great. What I will say is, if you look at the lower bowl, it's more or less okay. I don't know how good it's going to be, but I do think that with this booking, with the Cormier and Lewis, they pulled themselves out of a worst-case scenario. I think that you can, at a bare minimum, give them. We'll see what happens on Saturday night. Now, let's talk about some of these stakes. Danny, I'll go to you on this one. This was kind of interesting. Let's start with the challenger, Derrick Lewis, here. Let me ask you something. This is something I've been contemplating. Let's say he wins on Saturday, however unlikely that might be. Where would that put him in terms of the unlikeliest UFC champions in history? That's a tough one, isn't it?
That is a very tough one.
Let me help you out a little bit.
I would say Matt Serra has to be.
So Serra, Bisping, and if you look from an odds perspective, you would have like a Ray Borg. Well, he didn't win, but a Holly Holm would be in the discussion as well. So in those names, if he wins, however remote that possibility, where does he rank? I
think I would put him at second because Matt Serra is always going to be, up there as well. But, given the fact that Derrick Lewis, he hasn't gone out there and, in some cases he's beaten up all of his opponents, but in a lot of cases he's had to come back to win. So if he does pull that off, it's not like it's a surprise, whether as Matt Serra fighting GSP, not too many people saw that outcome coming. So I think it's up there, but again, given that it's at a heavyweight fight, given Derrick Lewis' past record, if he does pull it off, it wouldn't be all that crazy. It would kind of make sense because that's what he's been doing all his entire UFC career.
Yeah. The heavyweights are always tough, right? Because they carry so much power that no chin is that indestructible. You know what I'm saying? So Daniel Cormier, as great as he is, if he absorbs one big shot from Derrick Lewis, it's just like the old story, right? He's going to go down.
And we've seen Cormier
We've seen him.
Derrick Lewis, UFC champion? that seems crazy.
So now if you get into this, because we say this, but it would be truly shocking to me to see him with his hand raised with Daniel Cormier, because we've only seen Daniel Cormier lose to one man, and that's John Jones. So that would be truly strange. To me, it's almost like that monkey wrench type situation that the Bisping one you mentioned, it would be like that. A fight that was kind of cobbled together to save a card, where all of a sudden you come away with a new champion and a whole new scheme. Like the whole division then shifts, and it goes through Michael Bisping, and it changes everything.
Divisions would shift.
Exactly.
Right.
I feel like that's what would happen. It would get a little bit complicated in its own way, because right now we're obviously talking. We're kind of thinking two fights with Daniel Cormier. We're thinking of the Brock Lesnar fight that he wants maybe in January or February. So I think that kind of screws up a lot of plans if that happens. And then all of a sudden you're dealing with Derrick Lewis. What do you do with him? You know what I mean? So it'd be like the Bisping thing for me.
I would say Lewis not as unlikely of a champion as Jermaine Durand to me, or Nico Montano.
Well, let me hold on, push you there. Nico is interesting, but she didn't beat anyone already in the UFC to get it.
That's right.
And Jermaine Durand to me had an incredible career in kickboxing prior to that. So I would push back a little bit. Why would you still say those are more unlikely than him?
Because I feel like if you just take Derrick Lewis's record and his resume and forget all the my balls was hot and forget all all
I
the
can't,
funny
Mark.
stuff.
I can't.
Don't look at his Instagram and just look at the man's record. And you say this guy became
good.
UFC champion.
Yeah.
Well, there's no. I mean, we're only saying that because the context that he's been put in has been like, here is this heavyweight fighter who's like, he's a comedy character. He's not really taken seriously as a contender. He's just a guy that we laugh at.
True.
He says funny stuff. He puts memes up on Instagram. That's Derrick Lewis. If you just look at his record, you're like, all right, that guy's a legitimate elite UFC fighter without knowing anything else. That's why I say he would.
He's won
he would
9
be,
out of 10,
Yeah.
which is a ridiculous stat, you know, for the heavyweight division especially.
But the interesting part, I think people, why they doubt him, as I mentioned before, the way in which the fight was booked just didn't serve his interest. Also, boy, he has snatched victory from the jaws of defeat a number of times. The last one is not the only one. There's been a few of those. But I just think there's a bigger story here. Did you guys watch the countdown at all? It's okay if you didn't. I normally skip them too, to be quite honest with you. And I don't know. I was, I take the train so often these days. I have just hours to kill. So I pulled it up on YouTube and I started watching. They went back to the old prison where he was incarcerated. And he talked about, he talked about how he showed the field where he grew peppers and 6 in the morning, getting up on the chain gangs.
Check it out.
All this kind of stuff. To go from prisoner to UFC champion. I don't feel like anyone's talking about this. That would be, you want to talk about a life turnaround. Didn't Daniel Cormier say something about this
He did.
at the workouts?
He did during the scrum, exactly what you just said. And Daniel Cormier basically said today that I'm not buying the Derrick Lewis doesn't work hard gimmick. I'm not buying this. He said it's a facade. He said this guy has built himself up from nothing. He went from being in jail to being an elite UFC heavyweight fighter. He's like, that guy knows how to fight. He's fought back from, I think he's at the pits of hell. So he's not buying this whole, I'm not, he's this lazy guy who likes to eat, chicken and then messes around. Like he thinks that's all a gimmick. He thinks that's all BS. He thinks that Derrick Lewis is the real guy, is the guy that was in prison not too long ago who came back up and has changed his life.
I'll tell you what, before there was this comedian that has emerged over time, this Derrick Lewis now, talking to him after his first fight with, what was the guy's name? Jack May, I believe it was, in Orlando. You remember that we did this feature on him, and basically he was not the guy he is now. I did a piece on him, and he was more about his humble beginnings. He was where he came from. He just hearing Bruce Buffer call his name was like something that he had dreamed of. You know what I mean? He had been working with like George Foreman. He had worked with him way back in the day. The guys, I mean, he was on the streets. He grew up in a very rough area, both in Houston and I think it was Louisiana too.
New Orleans.
Yeah, New Orleans, and he's gone through a lot of childhood, a lot of bad scenes on the streets and stuff like that. So you're right. For him to actually get to this point should be celebrated. And you're right. It was cobbled together so quickly. I don't think that we've had a chance to actually let that soak in properly.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but I think that if he wins, that then becomes a huge story for him.
Yeah. That's right.
I think to your point, I think he plays down a lot on how good he is. Given his post-fight comments, given that he's never out there calling for his title shots. He's even said, I'm not ready for a title shot. And he's even said, he's like, I'm surprised that I'm even here, that I got to this point. Yeah. So in a way, I feel like a lot of people are underestimating it. It's very smart for Daniel Cormier to pick on that because you just got to look at the stats. You just got to look at the facts. The fact is that he's beaten 9 heavyweights. He's come out from adversity. He's shown cardio. He's shown, grappling defense, and he's got, knockout powers.
He's got like an amazing ability to kind of restore his energy for a minute and then throw a bomb. Like every time I think he can't even lift his arms, you'll see him all of a sudden wing a big shot. Like, whoa. Because usually those heavyweights, if he gets to the third round, they're like underwater. They're moving so slow, but he still can throw that punch at the end, which is somehow he finds
funny.
it.
He's got a rep for having bad cardio, but at the end of the day, he's one of these fighters that when he gets exhausted, he can operate at a much higher level than other people can when they're exhausted.
Yeah, Cormier said he thinks that he plays possum. In the fight, where he's not actually as hurt or as tired.
We were talking a little bit about
which is technically illegal, but not in the way that Lewis does it. Yes. Lewis doesn't like go, oh, my eye hurts, and then people, either relent or something. Right. He just kind of picks his battles.
Well, in that last fight, there was multiple times where he kind of hunches over. Yeah. And you think he's in big trouble because he's hurt. And we talked about this a little bit. He just has to
go to the bathroom, man.
And then it's good night, Irene. Last thing about Lewis, then we'll shift to Cormier. I feel like this is no lose for Daniel Cormier. Yes, he's going into a cage fight with a very, very dangerous man, so in that sense, there's a lose. But all he has to do is perform up to what I think are very modest expectations of him, even if those expectations are unfair. All he has to be is just the guy who, hey, go in there, give us a good showing, land a good punch or two, get the crowd roaring, and people won't I don't think hold it against him. They kind of expect Cormier to win. That's up. I mean, that's not like ultimately what you want, but that's not the worst position to be in, I think.
And I would also add to that outside of expectations, that Cormier, who is considered one of the GOATs, that he's supposed to win this, Derrick Lewis is one of these weird guys that their brand doesn't depend on contendership on the title. He kind of falls in like Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz
That's a good point.
reign, where it's like people are not tuning in to watch him become a number one contender or watch him go for the title. And, you know, unlike other heavyweights like Stipe say, like everything was about being the best and having, you know, that title. Derrick Lewis's brand, whether he wins or loses on Saturday night, it's still going to be very strong. If anything, it's going to be stronger. So I don't think it's dependent on the title.
No one thinks of him as this top heavyweight. I think of him as the court jester, not as the king.
I remember a long
Court
time ago.
Jester was the only one in Shakespeare plays who could tell the king what time it was, though. That was the interesting part about it.
I was saying, like, it wasn't that long ago, but it was probably 5 or 6 fights ago. I brought up the idea of Derrick Lewis against Overeem, and I remember people laughing. They were laughing, like, "Are you crazy? Derrick Lewis, he's not to that caliber." And here he is. I mean, it's kind of crazy because I just don't think that he didn't move up the ranks in the typical way. I think a lot of times you see guys and you know they'll be in a title shot within a year. Francis Ngannou, for instance, we saw him coming a little more. But a guy like Derrick Lewis, he kind of stays in this area that you don't take him too seriously, and then he ends up in this position. And it would be just very UFC for him to somehow pull this off and then have to deal with the chaos of that.
Cormier stands out to me for any number of reasons. My God, you could put a microphone in that guy's face for the rest of time, and you will never get bored. He is such a gifted person in so many different ways. It's really quite remarkable. Here's what stands out to me about him, Chuck, if I may go to you on this one. In an era where everyone is trying to go against the UFC to make money, he goes in every direction they ask him, and he is doing it all the way to the bank. He's a double champ. He's a commentator. Lord knows he might do it for WWE or something, for Fox. Here he is helping them out in MSG and getting richer and richer, more notoriety. In an era where everyone's mad, he's glad.
It's true.
He reminds me of like a modern day Matt Hughes in a way. All these guys who I'll do the UFC a solid and I'll still be successful on top of it. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do agree with it, and I will say this. He's very sincere. He's the most sincere fighter I think I've ever talked to. He tells you exactly what's going on. I don't really feel like he's sugarcoating. I think he sees things a certain perspective, but I think he gives you his genuine feelings towards stuff, and he's very articulate. He's able to get into a fighter's head. He's able to communicate that. He's probably the one guy who can put you into a fighter's head. I don't know if there's a more effective person out there doing that.
Rashad Evans, but yeah.
I mean, there are a couple, but I just feel like he's consistently smart in what he's saying, and there's something to it. He loves the UFC. And the bottom line is they need guys like that because it doesn't come across as phony. It doesn't come across like he's shilling to them. It comes across like he's being Daniel Cormier. And this is why the WWE, for instance, has been calling him. They want that realness to translate over to their side of things. You know what I'm saying? I think that he's got that kind of appeal. But just talking to him on Monday a little bit, he said that he'll always be involved with the UFC. I mean, he's that loyal. He's like, I'll always be involved with the UFC. He's like, if he does other stuff, it'll be on top of his stuff he's doing with the UFC.
Any lesson to take from that, guys? I mean, I just feel like it's so unusual. Now, I don't know that every guy could pull that off. Yeah. And I made this point about the Demetrious Johnson trade with Ben Askren. We'll get to that in just a second. Not everyone's a good fit for this organization. He seems to be a great fit for this organization.
Yeah, it seems in this day and age, as soon as you get the belt, is your time to exercise your leverage, right?
Like Nurmagomedov, 50 million.
50 million.
Yeah, you get the belt handgun time, you know? It's like you rob the bank after you win it. It's sort of weird in MMA.
But there's certain benefits that go with playing with the UFC, right? Look at Michael Bisping. It's a guy that, had a lot of shots and, he was giving a short notice opportunity, capitalized it. And then after that, you can make the argument that he was given favorable matchups, right? Or good money fights that he deserved. So yeah, there is some truth to that. And it does help to play with the UFC sometimes.
It's funny, as Ben Folks wrote a piece on him years ago called The Indestructible Man. Do you remember this? It was a Cormier feature talking about his tragic past. And just all the stuff. It was a good piece because back then, I think he was still a Strikeforce and he was coming into the picture. But, it's kind of crazy too. We're talking about Derrick Lewis, but it's kind of crazy too how much he's had to overcome in his life just to be in this. And the way he handles everything with just such a plumb, like he was mentioning 13 hours of media, he just handles it, man. He just goes out and does his stuff. And in this day and age where guys are just like, I don't really want to do. He's a very big picture guy. Just having, at 40 years old, I want out. I have 2 fights left, just planning everything. But I think he maybe this goes back to his wrestling days. I think these guys sometimes have this kind of dogged pursuit of what they have to do. They just go about getting it done. And it feels like he has that more than anybody because he doesn't, shirk away from his responsibilities.
Mark, what does he get with a win? I mean, he gets to keep his belt, obviously, but is there anything, like, what's on the line for him here?
Fight with Brock Lesnar and a boatload, a Brinks truck full of money is pretty much on the line. If he loses that fight, I don't know what he does from there because he has probably if he's going to stick to this March drop dead deadline of when he's going to retire, that means there's really only one more fight left. Reasonably, I can't imagine him fitting 2 more in before March. He wants it to be Brock Lesnar. If he loses to Derrick Lewis, it can't be Brock Lesnar. So then what? Then what does he do? He said he can still come back and defend the 205-pound title, but I don't know if that's. I don't know how the UFC feels about him saying that.
He's banking on the UFC. Well, he did say that basically the UFC has assured him that if he loses his belt, he would be next in line for the new champion at 205. So he's kind of has his like safety net in place, I guess, to be in another title fight.
But if John Jones beats Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232, John Jones is going to fight Brock Lesnar. I would be shocked if they didn't fight.
Interesting.
Brock Lesnar's going to come back. He's coming back to fight somebody.
You're already peeling back the onion of all the different scenarios, how chaotic it could get if that happens.
And that could be the situation where DC and the UFC actually become at odds for the first time. You talk about him being company man. He hasn't really been in that situation where things have gone against him. But if he loses this fight, they could go against him. John Jones, Brock Lesnar's in the testing pool. He's ready to go in the beginning of January. He's going to fight somebody. I don't know who it will be yet. If it's Dan Cormier, it's probably going to be him. If it's not Dan Cormier, it's got to be John Jones. That's the fight that Brock Lesnar wanted anyway. That's the one that he really wanted.
Interesting. All right. Before we get to some of the other pieces of the bottom of the card, very quickly, the co-main event, it's now going to be Jacare taking on Chris Weidman. A fight I actually like a lot. I think there's a ton of merit to this. So let me roll this question out like a grenade to the table. Who wants to jump on it? Winner of that fight, true or false, gets a title shot.
True if it's Chris Weidman.
Ooh, okay. Why?
He has a win over Kelvin Gastelum, who is the number 1 contender, who's fighting Robert Whittaker, I believe, probably in February, I guess. And Weidman said today at Open Workouts Weidman said on Wednesday at Open Workouts that if he were to beat Jacare at UFC 230, he would then be, I guess, what we're calling the backup fighter or the alternate fighter for the middleweight title fight.
Interesting.
So he'll go to wherever that fight is, and he'll be there in case something goes wrong.
But for Jacare, so what's left for him, boys?
I think it also depends on what goes down between Whittaker and Gastelum, because if Gastelum wins, Gastelum pieced up, Jacare. So, I don't see him getting that shot anytime soon. I think.
And Whittaker beat Jacare too, knocked him out.
That's true. Yeah. So, Jacare's in a weird spot.
But Weidman beat Gastelum, and if Jacare smokes Weidman,
we're doing
you get a little bit of a weird, dicey situation there. What do you think?
Jacare's lost to both of them.
I know.
Yeah.
I feel like Jacare always has the hardest path of anybody. And it's crazy because he had that long winning streak. If he wasn't going to take over the thing, then I don't know if he'll do it. I kind of agree with you. I think if Weidman wins, I could see a scenario where he's getting the title shot.
Do you remember when Michael Bisping was the guy who could never get the title shot, but then he ended up falling in his lap and then he won the title? Somehow Jacare, a guy thought everyone was going to be the champion of the UFC at some point or another. He's ended up in that position.
Yeah, it felt inevitable at one point, especially when you see at one point you start to see his stand-up improving and you're like, dude, watch out if this guy learns how to strike.
Yeah, forget
it. It just never materialized. The guy just kept getting penultimate, he was always booked into title eliminator type things. It just never got there for him. I kind of feel bad for him because he's been one of those guys who's just quietly one of the cool vintage MMA guys. Like if you've been watching him all this time, going back, all the way back to Japan and stuff like that. He's been doing it a long time. So it would be nice if he came out and he just made a great performance that he gets considered. I don't think that'll happen, though.
All right, let's go down the table. Any other performer, any other fight, any other thing you got your eye on this card? Chuck, go first.
Man. Well, I tell you what, the women's fight with Eubanks becomes intriguing to me in the sense that, she came, I think a lot of people learned who she was just from the whole bait and switch with this MSG card. Now she's got a spotlight, I think a little bit of a spotlight for this card. And, she's fighting, a very tough fighter in Roxanne. I think that's the one that I'm kind of under the radar a little bit looking at and wondering how she does, because I feel like she might have a chance to turn some eyes towards her.
I would say Israel Adesanya, if he's able to beat Derek Brunson and do so in impressive fashion, that's his That's his ticket. It's MSG. It's a big spot for him. It's his first time on kind of a big show, pay-per-view main card. So I think if he gets a big win, that's something to look at for him. And 2019 could even be a title opportunity at some point down the line.
I agree with both their picks. Those were my top ones. Either or, I think
we jack your picks, Danny.
Yeah, you did. I was hoping you didn't say Adesanya, but to your point, Eubanks, she was put in this weird spot, right? Now there's a storyline in a way. Like if she does get a big win, and she's been very vocal out there, if she goes out there, calls out Valentina, I mean,
calls out Joe Rogan.
Yeah, you never know. That post-fight interview, if she wins,
got some fire, that's for sure.
Bro's gonna
so
get
now she's got a story.
awkward.
And Adesanya as well, he's been killing it.
Adesanya has a chance, I think, as all the people, obviously, you're going to watch a guy like him because he has this buzz. He has that weird it buzz that you only get with certain guys. I think he has a real chance to just steal the show. But Derrick Brunson, man, I mean, see, this is the one. You're like, you get into these fights and you're like, if you clear this hurdle, this is when you start to really, it becomes legit, right? Like you start to really believe that buzz.
You have to be extremely skilled to beat Derrick Brunson.
Yeah.
You can't. Nobody that beats Derrick Brunson is subpar. You have to be at the top. So
I like these guys though that just the escalation of who they were, for when they started getting spotlight to the bigger and bigger moments. It's always fun. That's one of the fun things in fight game. He's certainly got that going right now.
All right, so let's jump to the other big topic that we look back on that already happened. Ben Askren has come to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It's confirmed. And Demetrious Johnson goes to one championship. Now, this topic has been talked about to death. So, Chuck, I'm going to go to you first. I'm going to ask it in this way. When you think about this, after everything that's happened, after everything that these two guys have said about what has gone down and why it went down, what's the best way to understand this deal?
Whoa, man. Well,
which I know is a broad question.
It is.
But
the best way to understand it is probably a bigger picture sense that there is a clamoring, I think, there's been to see what Ben Askren can do in the UFC. Him and Dana have always been at odds, and there's also, in conjunction with a disgruntled factor of a champion that they had at the top for a long time that they just didn't know what to do anything with at this point. And so if they had the opportunity to switch it out, which they did, I think that they kind of jumped on that chance a little bit, and both parties win. I think the UFC, it was obvious that the UFC was in the position like to just not do it because they never do things like this. So for them to actually go through with this was the surprising part of this. But then you look at it, and I'm not even sure they want to keep 125 pounds. We've kind of been talking this a little bit, and I think the writing is on the wall a little bit, and this is the first piece. But bringing Ben Askren over, it just opens up so many possibilities. People love when that partition comes down, and I think I think Dana White has realized it for years that people want to see this guy fight in the UFC. I just think it's perfect for them.
What's the best way to understand it?
It's just surreal to me that it actually that we're talking about it, because it's just literally 2 weeks ago, none of us knew that could even be a thing.
Right.
Yeah. Like no one was saying, except like in some hokey articles about, what if there were trades in MMA? I think that we probably had one on MMAfight.com. Sorry, guys.
Hashtag clickbait.
Hashtag clickbait. But we didn't know that could be a thing. We didn't even know that. Yeah. We didn't know that that was in the contract. So it's just it opens the door, I guess, for other trades to happen. Yeah. And I feel like that has
trades.
Yeah. Right. It's right. Exactly. It's more of a handshake agreement to release both fighters and have them both sign with the. Yeah. There are a lot of moving parts to these things, but it's interesting to me because it seems like fighters I think it's cool. Like they think that it's a possibility. I asked Chris Weidman today who he'd fight if they could make trades, and he said Bob Sapp. So
I'd watch that.
That's kind of interesting.
That's interesting.
So like fighters have like these ideas about who they might want to fight. I think that ultimately it could be a good thing for the sport, as long as the fighters are the ones who are going to be affected or okay with it. Yeah. If they were trying to trade Askren and DJ and DJ didn't want to go, that would be a major problem.
No trade clause.
But yeah, exactly. But because they both wanted it and this is a rare trade, and you follow. You guys all follow the mainstream sports, the big sports. It's very rare that a trade is like a win-win, right? It's from the jump, trades are talked about in the context of
who won
that trade,
all zero sum.
Who won the trade? Right. Who got the better of the other? It really feels like, and maybe in 4 years it'll be different, but it really feels like ultimately that this is good for all parties involved, which is weird.
you could look at it and say, like, man, I would have loved to have seen Demetrious Johnson fight a couple of the bantamweights that we'd always talked about, we'd contemplated. It would have been fun. But it never seemed like he was overly enthusiastic about jumping weight classes or taking these guys on. So if that's not going to happen, it's just going to sit in this limbo. It's perfect for him to continue his career. He's already broke records. He has UFC records. Those belong to him. They may be tough to break, the type of records he has. So he gets to go over there. Matt Hume is one of the executives over there at one. So I think that going over there, honestly, I think he has the chance to be kind of a cult hero over there a little bit. I'm just not sure he was ever able to achieve that here. And, to an extent, there were certain diehards. The big argument was like, how do you get him to translate? How do we get the flyweights to translate? And we've had this discussion a million times. I think it'd be interesting, let's put it that way, to see kind of how he translates over in Asia. But the Ben Askren one is really interesting because we know his fighting style, right? But sometimes there are guys, Nurmagomedov being an example of a guy who takes things to the ground, and we don't talk about him in an ambient sense. We talk about him in a sense of dominance. And I wonder if we will have that same attitude towards Ben Askren.
What do you think, Dan?
For me, big picture-wise, it opened my eyes for... It seems like the UFC already has like certain protocols on how to handle things. Like, right, if you're a fighter in the UFC, you could do this, you can do that. And then there's certain things that happen throughout the history of the sport and the company that kind of just blow your mind, and you're like, oh wow, this can actually happen. Like Mayweather fighting Floyd Mayweather, the UFC can actually make a fight, a UFC fighter fight a boxer. They can make that happen. And now this trade, it kind of opens my mind. Well, now what? Like if they did this, it can open the eyes, the possibilities for so much more.
It is funny for so long, the sport is relatively young, but for so long in the Zuffa era, none of this would have seemed possible. Suddenly there's all these weird things happening. You're like, what's next?
Same thing with free agency. Like for a while, free agency was never heard of. And then all of a sudden we had to have the first free agent. And then you start thinking, oh wow, there is possibilities. So this is another one. And this is a very interesting one because there's a lot of fighters out there outside of the UFC, obviously including Ben Askren, that are interesting fighters, and they're very skilled fighters that people want to see in the UFC. So people start already talking about Michael Chandler, and I quote tweet Scott Coker with the thinking emoji and the light bulb trades. So this is all fun, and I think this is great.
Great thing about Ben Askren is he has a lot of haters. Haters are perfect because they want to tune in to see you get your comeuppance. So that's what the first fight, whoever he fights, the partition is down, doesn't matter. People are going to tune in just to see him get humiliated, possibly, right? Like that's going to be the allure, half of the allure. So those type of guys, I love that. You know what I mean? Because he's just lighting everybody on fire right now.
And he's fine with that. He's completely cool with playing the heel and being the guy people turn in to watch get beat.
Here's what I think. My big takeaway as I try to imagine what's the best way to understand this deal, I feel like the UFC finally told us who they are. This was the week where they've basically said, okay, we admit it, this is who we are. Which is to say, in a different era when they were just trying to be, there was a time when the UFC was trying to be everybody's promoter to every weight class, to every kind of fan. Doesn't matter what kind of fighter, doesn't matter if you're the best, we want you, not every kind of fighter in the sense of terrible, but in a certain space, we're just going to be everyone's promoter. And I think they decided that that was not something that they're interested in doing anymore. And after they're not interested in doing it, what are they looking for? And they basically said, we kind of already had this best guy. They still want good guys because the belief is that if Askren bottoms out, okay, that kind of hurts him a little bit, but it's a risk they're willing to take, and he might actually be really good, so that it's still a component. But in the end, the quiet video game champion is not as important to them as the guy who will go out there and do that to everybody, who will run his mouth, who will promote himself, who might be really good. They basically said, this is what we're looking for, and this is not what we're looking for.
It's amazing.
And they had never made that so explicit until this week.
And Askren doesn't just poke other fighters. He obviously pokes the bear, which is Dana White, all the time, and he has been for a long time. So there's a bit of, I agree with you. There's a concession in play there. There's something that's basically a declaration if they're bringing him aboard.
That's Halloween, or was yesterday?
Yeah.
It was a pulling up of the mask, like, this is who we are.
It was an acknowledgement that the UFC is no longer actively trying to have the best fighters in the world under their umbrella.
All of them. We got to have all of them.
Right. They used to feel that way, right? Or at least they used to say that. But, I mean, we've already seen those signs where they let a guy like Gegard Mousasi leave, or a guy like Rory McDonald, who are still elite, top 3, top 5
Ryan
fighters
Bader,
in their weight classes. Ryan Bader is another one. So we've already seen that, but this was the ultimate, like you said, because you had the guy who, we're talking about someone who's one of the best fighters of all time, still in his prime, just lost a very controversial split decision to lose the belt after setting the record for most title defenses. He's still one of the guys in the sport, and they're like, all right, take that guy. We'll get the trash talking funky Ben Askren, who's a very good fighter, of course, maybe even an excellent fighter, but who is going to do, like you said, and kind of be an antagonist and kind of kick things up.
Danny, we'll get on the line. Any downsides you could think of? It's hard to think of one right now because right now you're like, wow, this works for all the parties. Is there any way that this could give rise to some other practice that we end up saying, oh my God, what a mess this has become?
I don't see anything like that at the moment because at the end of the day, the UFC had to be in agreement for this trade to happen, as well as, Demetrious Johnson, all the parties involved. So I don't see this opening the possibility of bad things coming in. And even if, for example, Ben Askren, from a sporting standpoint, goes in there and he's not the guy that we thought he was. He's not the best fighter, which I don't think that'll happen. But just goes in there and doesn't have great performances, and then they let go one of the best. We still had to find that out, right? And either way, it's still going to speak volumes on how good the welterweight division is in the UFC, right? So either way, I just think this is a win-win. I don't see any possible negative effects coming from this.
What do you think?
I don't see any real downside to it because, like Danny said, worst case scenario, Ben Askren comes in and stinks up the joint. But maybe then you could say, all right, that was a law, like we were talking about before, where they lost the trade. But I don't think I think the UFC was willing to take that hit because they really weren't in the Demetrious Johnson business anymore.
I think that's
they
right.
really weren't.
Or in the flyweight business.
They weren't, or they may not even be in the flyweight division business anymore. So they were willing to take someone who they really had no use for in a practical sense. At least they felt that way. I disagree. And ship him off for someone who has upside. And if that upside doesn't turn into anything, that's okay because they've shipped off what they think is kind of a spare part, which is really a horrible way to describe one of the best fighters of all time. But it seems like that's what they're doing.
Yeah, it just seems to me like a creative perfect storm. Honestly, you had two guys that just made sense. This may open the door in the end for discussions like this, but right now it's the first time. So you just look at it and you think like, hey man, it's a perfect storm for these two guys to swap places and do this, and that's all it is. I can't foresee how it would be detrimental, but I could foresee this being the precedent where now other guys might want this at some point, but we'll see how that plays out. Right now, though, I can't think of any negatives.
Who will be the first fighter to demand a trade?
How is Nate Diaz not done this yet?
I know, I'm shocked that he hasn't.
And by the way, the point
I demand a trade.
And the point I've made before, people are like, oh, I feel so bad for Demetrious. I'm like, well, it'd be in a perfect world, he would be in the biggest promotion making the biggest dollars. But the perfect world is not the one we live in.
Yeah.
Trust me, if it was a perfect world, I'd be doing some interesting things right now.
But wouldn't be hosting this show.
Yeah, I'd be this dump. But the point being is, it's not the world we live in. I think he's a great fit for that organization, and I think Ben Askren's a great fit. I do not think Nate Diaz is a good fit for the UFC. That isn't to say that if they can't find a way to get along, they can't do business together. They have undercut each other. They cannot get along. If you're sitting on the shelf for 2 years in your 20s and 30s, bro, there is a problem. Yeah. That means there is a malfunctioning relationship. They don't work well together. If I'm the Diaz brother, I'm looking for a way out ASAP. All right, we got to move along, though. Khabib Nurmagomedov, who may invite Nate Diaz, God only knows at this point. Let's talk about this real quickly. Danny, I'll start with you. What the hell is he doing? So here's what I'm trying to figure out. You got his manager coming out saying, we're not going to find anyone for less than 50 mil, which, by the way, on some level, I can kind of understand, to be perfectly honest with you. Then he's telling Tony Ferguson, you are a great fighter, but you're an easy one. By the way, you can go fight GSP. But it's like, wait, I thought that GSP and Khabib was the big fight. Floyd seems to be out of the headlines. Thank you, Jesus. What is his next fight going to be? Because they won't be Tony. Maybe it's GSP, but I don't know if that's going to be it. They want 50 mil? What the hell is happening?
I have no clue. I have no idea what's happening. This is just very confusing. I think a lot of it with the 50 mil, and I'm not going to fight you, a lot of it is just kind of playing hard to get so that the UFC might have to, throw a little more for them to actually go out there and fight Tony Ferguson. But I do think that's the fight to make. And look, Khabib got to this point wanting to fight the very best. And that was his whole thing. I mean, he didn't even want to fight Conor McGregor. The fight was there, and he took it because, the UFC wanted to make it. But he was out there just to fight the best. And Tony Ferguson, he's the best. I think these two are just on an inevitable path that's going to eventually, at some point, hopefully, fingers crossed, come together. So I think that's just a little bit playing hard to get, to make that fight happen. But I think it eventually will, or who knows what GSP says as well. Also, with Ben Askren coming in, He's talked about the 165-pound division. So there's a lot of things up in the air. I think in the next few months, as soon as we see, how things play out, even what happens with Conor McGregor, I think we'll see how Khabib, makes a decision.
I think if you ask Khabib and his team who is the best, they don't say Tony Ferguson. They say George St. Pierre.
That's right.
I think that is why. That's what they're going to angle for. And they telegraphed it. They said it even before the McGregor fight. Khabib wants GSP. Khabib said, I believe he said in Calgary when he was doing a fan Q&A back in July, that his father told him once, you have to beat George St. Pierre in order to become the best. That is the guy that they've always
conversation
that his father has already set as the benchmark for him.
He is the patriarch in that family, isn't he?
And
Wow.
Khabib cares very much what Abdul Manap says. And I think that's the fight they're going to try to get. And part of me can't begrudge them for that, but part of me also wants to see him fight Tony Ferguson.
Don't you think it's a really bad idea? When you really begin to think of it, you're like, wow, that'd be a big fight. That'd be amazing. I mean, the fight itself would be unbelievable,
right?
Which is probably why it's going to get made. Kill me. However, when you begin to think about like what that does to Tony Ferguson and what happens if they do it at 155, which they may not, but even if they do it at 170, there's just a lot of ways that could just damage a lot of things around it. Are you in favor of that idea? Mr. Pro Wrestling?
I'm not in favor of it, but I also, like I said, would not begrudge them for doing it because I think it's the bigger fight.
Certainly that.
It's the bigger fight.
Yep.
And I'm also of the feeling that, hey, Khabib Nurmagomedov, go get paid. Go get as much money as you can possibly get. If that means fighting GSP, sure. But does it throw divisions off course? It certainly could. If they did it for like a vacant 165-pound title, that would at least not bring in any of the craziness. It wouldn't like mess up the 155 hierarchy too much. It would just make Ferguson have to wait a little bit longer. So I guess that would be okay, but I don't see that happening. I think it may be at 155, and then you run the risk of George St. Pierre winning that fight and then saying, well, all right, I'm the welterweight champion. I'll see you guys later. Vacate.
Thanks for the cheese.
We'll
see you later.
Thanks for the maple syrup.
That's the thing that gets me is I'm like, we just watched George St. Pierre come in, take a belt, and then say, I'll take it back after 33 days or whatever it was. It's kind of like
all he does is win belts and then hand them back.
Right. So basically, you're like, is that what we're doing again? Because that division has been, just like other divisions that George has been kind of hovering around, has been a little bit chaotic, and you don't really want to see it go down into any more rabbit holes, man. I mean, at this point, I'm like, I'd love to see the fight. I agree with you. If it's 165, if they're going to do something creative like that, go ahead. That has its own problems, but it would be less of a problem. If George St. Pierre comes to 155 and wins the belt, I just can't imagine he wants to stay at 155.
No way.
Maybe for the McGregor fight, I don't even know at this point, but it just adds a whole dimension. And who gets lost in this? The guy who's won, 10 fights in a row, Tony Ferguson?
I can't believe
which is one of the most dynamic fighters.
So dirty.
It would be devastating to the lightweight division, and we've already seen this happen. We saw what happened when Conor McGregor didn't defend the belt at featherweight. Chaos. What happened at lightweight? Chaos. What happened at middleweight when GSP won it? Or even when Bisping was champion and wasn't fighting the number one contenders. It all brings chaos because at the end of the day, these guys have to fight to make money. So number one contenders like Jacare, they're going to keep fighting. And eventually, every time you roll the dice, you're not going to get good numbers. Not every time, so.
It feels as though the UFC where there used to be like a flow of a division and there was some continuity and how it played out and the best fighters fought the best fighters. That seems to no longer be the case over the last maybe 3 or 4 years. And now it seems like, all right, someone's the champion, let's hot shot a super fight, or let's hot shot someone who's retired and coming back and he's a big name. Yeah. It's basically champion against whoever is the biggest name available, no matter the weight class. Yeah. And it didn't used to be like that, and I don't always mind it. I don't always mind it. I think that there are some cases where those are the best fights to make at that point, but it just seems like that. So like, I'm gonna put these in pro wrestling terms, which you're gonna absolutely hate.
You might as well just speak Japanese, bro.
But like when there are big matches in pro wrestling, there's like a logical, most of the time, build to it where it makes sense that it's happening. Whereas now in the UFC, it's like, all right, we're going to take that guy because he's a big name against that guy who's a big name. We're going to put them together. But there's no real And you never know what's next, because what's next is just another hotshot matchup between a big name and a big, champion somewhere.
The paradigm worked for a long time, though, because it was all going somewhere at all times. There was always a future behind it. It was what separated Strikeforce's model versus the UFC. Back in the day, Strikeforce would have two really good guys going at each other, but what did it say? What were the stakes? Nobody knew what the stakes were beyond that fight. There was no future behind it. But the UFC always had 5 guys waiting, and you're like, well, that was part of the fun, right? Was to project who's going to be next. It is a really, really weird time if you can no longer do that, because that's against the model itself.
The UFC, I know, the UFC is weird. It's like they keep handing the gun to a different guy to hold him hostage.
Yeah.
And they give it to Nurmagomedov, and he turns it right around and puts it on him, and then they give it to Conor, and he puts it on him, and it's really weird. It's this. I don't know what the answer is, other than I think if you paid them more up front, by the time they got to a position where they were making more money, or the most money given the role, they wouldn't be so aggressive. Like $50 million. People are like, oh, he's not worth $50 million. Yeah, but what about all the fights where he was underpaid before? Right? So if you bump that down to, like, let's say it's $40 million or $30 million, maybe he's owed $20 million in back pay or something.
And Nate Diaz brought that up perfectly years ago. He's like, they think they did me a solid with this. No, they're in debt. They're paying me from.
You're in arrears. So anyway, it's just kind of something to think about watching going forward. I don't know what's going to happen. I do hope that Tony gets the fight, just because I've never seen a more deserving contender in my life. Now, another deserving contender, I don't know if he's going to get the title shot. He had a big win at UFC Moncton, Mark. Anthony Smith, my goodness. A guy who, I've made this point before in my life about in any professional line of work. Some people in life, and this is sad, but it's true, some people in life, they kind of peak at like 16, 18, quarterback of the high school football team, and they just go on to just, piss away their lives. Some people do it at 22, some people do it at 30, some people don't do it till in their 70s. Everyone kind of peaks a little bit differently. And
I'm hoping for my growth spurt personally.
Any day now. But the point being is, he didn't get started with a great camp, and he didn't get started with a mentor. Had to kind of figure it out, and he made some mistakes, made a bunch of them, and not like going to jail. I mean, just professionally making good career choices. But slowly and surely, he has figured it out. Wow, what a win for him! What is your big takeaway from what Anthony Smith has done?
Yeah, I mean, just one of the better stories, I think, the better feel-good stories of 2018. And it's flying a little bit under the radar because it's kind of sandwiched in between the Conor Khabib mess and now DC against Derrick Lewis at 230. So it's not getting the kind of attention that maybe it would have gotten if it were on one of these big cards, or if it were maybe in a different part of the year. But yeah, Anthony Smith, man, is who would have thought a guy who, first of all, got knocked out earlier this year. He lost earlier this year. Who would have thought then that he'd be knocking on John Jones' doorstep in a sense now?
That is crazy.
Not only that, but how about Anthony Smith at 185? Journeyman, just another guy on the Fight Pass prelims. Oh, Anthony Smith's fighting. Okay, maybe it'll be an entertaining fight. I mean, Anthony Smith's just a guy, Even his name is even non-distinct.
I know.
Just another of the milieu of middleweights on the UFC roster. Just another guy. He's probably fighting Judo Dan Kelly tonight. He's just another middleweight guy, and now here he is on the cusp of a title shot. It's super cool.
Who was it not tonight? Was it Thiago
Santos?
Santos.
Yeah,
that fight, it's crazy because that fight is when I really saw how crazy he is, because he was getting, got hurt hard in that first, and he survived. I remember thinking, dude, this dude is tough. He kept coming, and he loses in the second round, but I remember leaving that fight thinking, watch out for him if he can get something going. And here we are. I don't know how many he's won in a row now. What is it, like three? Three in a row.
Right, so he beat Rashad, then Shogun, and then, by the way,
the Legends killer, right?
Didn't just win 3, finished all 3.
Finished all 3, and I think all 7 of them, including the one he lost, were finishes. The UFC loves this type of thing, you know what I mean? And he's won 6 of them. So I didn't see him come. I didn't see him coming to the point where he'd be a John Jones. I certainly thought he had a little bit of that, like a toughness factor. But what I really loved was that he basically foreshadowed exactly what was going to happen. He kind of knew that it was going to be rough weather in the first couple of rounds, and then in the third round he would have his moment. And it's crazy when guys do that, when they can envision a fight like that. Conor McGregor, we've heard him do it and things. It always makes you wonder how cerebral they really are, how much they really envision it and enact what they're envisioning.
And loves to do MMA media. Yeah. Oh my God, makes my job so easy.
He's good that way too.
The other thing that kind of stands out to me is like he's in Nebraska still. He's just training out there in Nebraska, and he's hopped around a little bit, but for the most part, like you get a guy like I don't know, somebody who's an up-and-comer at Justin Willis, for example, at AKA. You talk to Dana Cormier, he'd be like, this guy's amazing. Watch out for him. He's got big things. No one ever big upped Anthony Smith. He had no big famous figure who's like, you got to watch out for this guy. And for maybe a couple of reasons, like he was just a shell of himself at middleweight, but he just took the game by the scruff of the neck and just kind of, I love stories like that, man. It's like,
the fight game's at its best.
Truly. It's also about like the guys who have, everything comes easy for them, you know, but the ones who kind of stumble through their way to greatness, I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Another lesson too, I think, is just the moving up in weight. He was killing himself to make 185.
So true.
You know, why is Luke Rockhold still trying to make 185 after saying for years now how hard that weight cut is?
And I think it affects his chin. I don't think Luke Rockhold has a bad chin. I think he is so drained.
100%. So Anthony Smith, you know, a great guy, very good fighter, moves up. He was a mid-card guy at a middleweight. Now he's a title contender at light heavyweight. What is Rockhold at 205? I would love to know. I want to see it. I'm almost glad that he's injured and not making this fight with Weidman because he should be fighting 205. And I thought Weidman at 1.2 would have benefited greatly from going to 205. He was making hard weight cuts. He's changed his lifestyle to the point where he's trimmed now and he's not making that hard water cut like he used to. But Rockhold, man, every one of those weight cuts just takes years off his life, I'd hate to say, but it seems like it. And Yoel Romero's another guy, too. Yeah. Go to 205. Yeah. And what is that guy going to do at 205? He could be a monster.
I'm glad there are exhibits now of guys who are going up to the weight classes and succeeding. You know, Cowboy Cerrone, there's certain guys you've seen them go up and they've had success. I hope that it continues because I feel like the more examples there are of guys doing that, the more people will let themselves try it.
Yeah.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. Okay, a couple other topics I want to get to here. There was an interesting incident with Artem Lobov. So he goes against Michael Johnson. I thought Michael Johnson won what? Dominantly is a strong word, but it was pretty clear who was the winner in that one, right? And Artem Lobov to me is a very interesting case because to me he forces us to answer the question, who belongs in the UFC, right? Who should be here? It's a very difficult question to answer. You wrote a piece, and what you want to say?
I don't know if anybody read it though, but it
slipped under the radar big time.
Under the radar.
Let me be very clear about this. You wrote a piece. Look, I have my own biases. I thought it was it was a good piece per tradition, but nothing stood out to me as like incendiary. And then you apparently set all of Ireland on fire. To the point where,
I
know, right? To the point where Coach John Kavanaugh, he came out and he didn't necessarily have some nice things to say about your piece, but I would like you to just, if you want to respond to that in any capacity, you may. But I do think that the bigger question here is, Artem Lobov is an interesting guy that forces us to answer this question. So, does he belong? And if not, why?
Well, first of all, I'll just say, for the record, I respect that camp. I respect John Kavanaugh. I always have. I don't think I've actually ever written anything about him in bad taste. Most of my stuff, if you follow what I do, is there's levity behind it. Basically, I try to tap my foot a little bit as I'm writing these pieces. You take a little bit of a perch. Maybe you treat, like this thing, the subtext was really that the UFC keeps putting him into these main events or co-main events. And why? Well, it's because of his association with Conor McGregor. They can say whatever they want. That is the truth. And everybody knows this. Everybody goes around making jokes about, hey, here comes the GOAT. He's 13-15 undefeated. You know, there's these types of jokes, right? I was kind of playing off that. It was meant to be a little bit more in a fun spirit than maybe it came across. I realized maybe the tone was a little bit off on it. But ultimately, man, I stand by it. That's exactly what I wrote, and I believe it. And here's the thing. I used his record as the context for the piece, right? Mm-hmm. His record was the context for the piece. Anybody, any coach, or whoever it is, if they come at you and denigrate what you do without the context, I deign not even answer it. You know what I mean?
Fair enough. Now, about the question about Artem.
As far as Lobov goes, man, honestly, I think he can fight at the UFC. They put him in these kind of crazy spots. Now, I think he was this was a good measure for me because I feel like Michael Johnson has kind of not panned out. Like at one point I thought he was going to be something, but he's kind of, I don't know, he's not been the guy that I thought he would be earlier on his career. So I thought this was a good gauge, but just kind of seeing it, ultimately,
it was short notice.
It was short notice. Ultimately, though, I'm like, I just don't see. He could fight another fight. I would like them to, if they're going to put him in a spot, put him on a prelim and put him against somebody that more of his scale. If they do something like that, I'm totally fine with it, because I understand he's a draw. I get the association, but ultimately, if they cut him, I mean, come on, they cut guys of this caliber. There's most guys of that caliber are not even on the roster anyway. So if they cut him, it's completely understandable and is justified at this point. So if you're asking if I would cut him at this point.
Right. What about you, Mark? What do you think? Let me reframe the question if I can for a second, because if you look at the defense that John Kavanaugh wrote, and others have brought it up as well, it's not really about that letter. It's like fans like him. He's engaging. Choo-choo, MFers. To your point, there's this whole like somewhat celebratory, somewhat insulting culture about him, calling him the GOAT. You're calling him the GOAT because he's so far from it, but it's also because you kind of like him. He has all of the things you would want out of a UFC fighter, except the kind of record that merits being here. So is all those other things, are those good enough to make up for that lack of achievement?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Chuck was saying, I don't think that first of all, I don't know what UFC caliber really means anymore. I don't know if it really has.
Very loose at this point.
Doesn't really have.
I don't really agree with that. I think you know.
I mean, I don't think it means as much as it used to.
That's true.
That way.
I agree with that.
So, do I think that Lobov could beat some fighters in the UFC for whatever that's worth? Yes, I do think so. Is he competitive at least with the fighters that he's been fighting? Absolutely, including guys that are ranked in the top 10 and top 5.
Including Khabib
Swanson. That was again, it wasn't a rout for Khabib Swanson, but it was a fairly comprehensive victory. But Lobov had his moments and he hung in there, and it looked like Swanson was fighting maybe not number 11 or number 12. It didn't look like he was fighting someone not in the rankings who has a sub 500 record. So ultimately, I think, and I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, I think that he could be in the UFC, but to Chuck's point, he's been put in a position where his drawing power is above where his skill level is, I guess. And we don't really know how much he can draw money-wise, but his profile, say, the amount of that he is well known is greater than his skill level. So that's why it kind of gets skewed. If he was a guy that had that record and he wasn't Conor McGregor's teammate and no one knew who he was, okay, he's a really tough fighter. He's in entertaining fights.
He'd be cut tomorrow.
He'd be cut tomorrow, but also there wouldn't be all that tongue in cheek about him. It'd be like, wow, this guy is just he's a gamer. He's a really tough. He's a gamer type guy. He'd almost be like a lesser, like of a Chris Lieben, kind of a lesser Chris Lieben, where wow, the guy's really tough as hell. Doesn't have the greatest record in the world, but because there's association to McGregor, there's some negativity with that. Because his profile is ahead of where his skill level is, that's kind of where I think the dichotomy and the negativity comes from.
I think the scale early on in the UFC, as far as skill-wise and how entertaining you could be, it used to be more on the skill side of things. As we've gone by, over the years, that has sort of shifted a little bit in how good you are with the media, how much you play ball with the UFC, all these other things, your associations, right? How much of a star power, that has shifted towards that direction a little more. As far as Artem Lobov still being in the UFC, I think he deserves one more fight. We've seen, for example, I think Dan Hardy at one point went 0-4, but he was exciting. He had, his hands. There was his whole persona about him, right? So there are things that you do have to keep in mind. And Artem Lobov, he does check a lot of those boxes. He does have 2 wins in the UFC. I would like to see him get another fight in the UFC. I think if he were cut, I wouldn't have a problem with it as well. I think, a lot of fighters have been cut with that same record. But if he were to get another fight, I don't think it'd be the end of the world. My main issue was, there's a lot of great fighters out there that, deserve to be in co-main event slots, main event slots. And Artem Lobov at this point, I don't sense that he's going to become all of a sudden this top contender at any point. But he is a guy that you can see on a card and you can pinpoint and recognize. So I think if they bump him to the prelims and he gets a fight there against somebody more of his caliber, and we'll see how that goes. I think that'll be a fair option.
This is an interesting test case because a lot of times you can get like, oh, he's just so-and-so's teammate or friend. But the reality is when they shone a light on him, fans begin to like him for reasons independent of his relationship to McGregor. But that relationship still feeds into it. So trying to parse it becomes kind of hard. And if you go back to Kavanaugh's letter, it's like, there was nothing in there I really disagreed with other than, are these enough reasons to merit inclusion? It's almost a separate question. But Lobov is in this weird space where you're like, well, everyone loves him, people know him, blah, blah, blah.
And he is a very likable person.
He's a likable guy.
Person, and you, like you mentioned, I think his intention is to go out there and he borrows some of that audacity that's going on in his gym. He borrows it. I was trying to point that out in the piece too. Like he wanted to say he was the hardest hitter in the division. It just hasn't really panned out to be the case. So, the premises we've been dealing with, they're a little false, they're a little exaggerated, and you're just at a place where he's 2-5. None of his fights have had finishes. So you're like, this is where you're at. I mean, you could cut him and you could give him another fight. Honestly, at this point, it's who's going to get mad either way. Right. But I just think that they should put him on a prelim against a guy that he should be facing at this point.
You know what? If they cut him, I bet Belter picks him up.
Oh, yeah. I think they would, too.
With a quickness.
Put him and Dylan Dennis on the same
are you kidding? Oh, my God. It's like Connor's most beloved friend and Connor's most hated friend on the same card. That'd be amazing. Yeah. All right, so let's get to
Gallagher on that card, too.
Exactly. Oh, you could kill it.
You could do an SPG versus the world.
You could do a big...
That's probably one
Scott
of the
Coker's getting ideas.
That's probably one of the reasons the UFC won't cut
they
him.
probably won't cut him because they know that they can do that. They can go to Dublin in a few months and do a big card.
That's a good point. One other topic I want to get to before we get to our last one is perhaps what appears to be the end of Project Spearhead. Now, there's nothing to declare. I certainly don't wish them any ill will. If anything, I wish that they would succeed. But there was an interview that fell by the wayside. I want to say, I know it was on Bloody Elbow. I think it was by... Well, maybe it was BJ Penn radio. It was either BJ Penn radio or it was Nick Baldwin of Bloody Elbow. Please forgive me for getting that wrong.
I'm pretty sure it was Bloody Elbow.
You sure?
Yeah,
okay.
With Cajun Johnson?
Yeah, with Cajun Johnson. Cajun Johnson spoke out, and basically what he said was a few things. Number one, when Leslie Smith got cut, that impacted a lot of fighters' willingness to sign these cards to become authorized to become a union. And there's many steps, but that's the first big one. Also, guys have signed them, but then have rotated out of the organization because the effort has taken a while. So they've lost that one. And then now Al's the only guy there because Cajun lost to Islam Makhachev, and he's gone. And basically, they're not even anywhere close to getting enough cards, about 150 or more, to be able to move the process forward of establishing a union. And it just kind of occurred to me, like, I don't know what the future is, and there's many other ways in which this could go. MMA-FA could be successful. I doubt that. Seems to me that won't make it through Congress, and if it does...
They're not trying to unionize anyway.
No, I mean, some kind of change to, they want the opposite, as a matter of fact, but some kind of change to the status of fighters. Yeah, I don't think it's going to make it through Congress, and even if it does, I don't think that's a legislation that President Trump would sign, given his relationship to Ari Emanuel. Could be wrong, but neither here nor there. Let's keep it about Project Spearhead. Mark or Dan, whoever wants at the table, is this the end?
There's finding I was going to get it. Oh, I hope we keep tying. Let's go for 5 minutes.
Okay, dummies.
Oh, wait. Is there a show going on?
My bad.
I mean, wow. What have I done with my life that has gone this wrong? So, okay.
Excuse me.
I'll go to you, Mark, and then Dan, you'll get the last question.
Sure.
You've covered these topics a lot. Is this the end of unionization efforts in MMA? Literally, if this fails, everyone has failed.
It's not the end of them. It's a major hit. It's certainly a major hit. I think that there's still a chance that Leslie Smith and things that are going on with her can still possibly lead to something like that.
She does have many efforts that she's still trying.
It's not the only effort. It was a promising one. It doesn't seem like it's as promising now in November 2018 as it was before. There's still a possibility of them appealing her case against the UFC with the National Labor Relations Board. That's still a possibility. It still seems like it's unlikely, but there are still open things that she has going on that could point toward that. Because worth noting, when she was turned down, when the NLRB said they're not going to hear that case, they said that they wouldn't hear the case because they didn't feel like she was retaliated against. They didn't say, we don't feel like you guys are employees. They said, we don't feel like you were retaliated against. They didn't even address the second part of that claim. So that's still open. So that's a little bit of a solace, a saving grace to that. But Project Spearhead not working out is a major hit. There's still some open pathways there, but it's still unlikely. It was always unlikely. It was always an uphill battle.
Right, but they're saying they're not even close.
They're not even. It was always.
That seems interesting.
And I think they have until somewhere in the beginning of next year to get those cards, and it's going to be hard to make that happen.
What lesson can you draw from this, Danny?
I mean, it's rough. The lesson that I can draw from it is that MMA still remains a very individualistic sport, and we just have to go back what happened. UFC 230 is happening this weekend, and the whole thing with Eubanks and Valentina Shevchenko and Joanna Jędrzejczyk, like Joanna Jędrzejczyk was supposed to fight Valentina, right? And then that fight got stripped, and they put in Eubanks in there, and then we saw what happened, and then they went back to Jędrzejczyk. And then Eubanks was perfectly content with filling in that spot, even though there was already a signed agreement. So it is a very individualistic sport. What some fighters lost is another fighter's gain, right? And in this case, with this specific situation, I mean, you got the interim vice president, right, Askren-Johnson, saying that it would require a miracle, require the second coming of Jesus to make this thing work. And, he knows better than most of us, and that's already very alarming. There was a time where the unionization efforts were very strong, and Project Spearhead, for me, was definitely the leading candidate of that. But with the things that are coming out from it, I just don't see it happening. And, maybe fighters do unionize, but I see that just happening way down the line. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, especially right now where you can talk your way into places, and now fighters get to, play a little bit more within their position in the UFC just outside of fighting,
Fighters have such a myopic view of their own careers. They think of themselves only, and they should, right? To an extent, that's their brand, and that's the only thing they see. And I think that when we're looking at this, when it first started, we liked the legitimacy of it because there was a couple of subtler players. They weren't just out there smiting their chest. They were doing it in a very grounded way. It was like the smart way to go about it. I remember we were talking about that. We're like, what are the odds that this will actually take hold? And you couldn't, none of us on the panel that day could be like, with any kind of certainty, like, well, I think it'll happen. Even with all the stuff, even with the TV rights and everything coming up that would benefit them to come together. It feels like it's an uphill battle for something that's a chaotic pool of fighters that are all individuals to bring them together and ask them to see the big picture, especially when people like Askren-Johnson end up cut, the writing's on the wall from Leslie Smith. It just seems like you're putting a bullseye on your back. And I think can you imagine a scenario at this point where people are just going to come together and pull together to make this thing happen? I feel like it'll never happen at this point.
I don't know what's going to happen. My read on it is I cannot close the door on it. Circumstances could change where this could make it a much easier situation 10 years down the road or something, right?
Yeah. True.
Who saw Ben Askren DJ trade for crying out loud, right?
There's so much every month, every year, there's something.
I will just say this. It's like, I don't know who signed those cards, but apparently there were very few in number. The fighters at this point have been presented 3 different times with opportunities to consider MMA unionization, and all 3 appear to have collapsed. I got to tell you, unless you're out there like an Ally Aquinta or a retired fighter who's putting your money where your mouth is, by the way, but this didn't come up, and I forgot to ask him when we had him on the MMA Hour on Monday. Ben Askren has been in my studio in DC to talk about being a part of the MMAFA. Again, not unionization, but still some kind of change for fighters. So I wonder if he's still part of that effort. But unless you're willing to do that, you can save your Instagram posts about how you're upset. I don't really give a shit anymore. The MMA media doesn't cover nearly as many stories as they're supposed to, or as they could for a lot of different reasons. But if there's one story that they owned and hammered home and told the world about, it was this one. As a matter of fact, I think we bored our listeners. I'm boring the listeners and viewers right now because they all know the story. And the fighter said, no thanks. So the next time something bad happens, I don't really care, to be honest with you. I'm done. I'm done trying to advocate on your behalf. I am. Sorry. That's it. We tried. You didn't want it? Okay. There we go. All right. We end on that sour note with, not that one. We have one more, and I always forget.
One more sour note.
I did not forget today. You know what? Only because I'm not totally brain damaged. Let's start at the end of the table per usual, Chuck. Time for Under the Radar. Some small story out there that maybe people didn't get a hold of, especially in a week like this. There's a bunch of crazy news. Anything small, just something small that you caught your eye.
Well, and here we are with this fight week again, and the UFC announces UFC 233, which will take place, I think, January 26th, I think it is, in Los Angeles. Bellator going on at the exact same time, and I like this.
Same city.
I've always dug this sort of thing when the UFC, when I feel like they're getting back into the aggression a little bit and trying to war, because it always feels like then there's a threat on the table, and so this becomes like the game within the game. So that's Under the Radar, where they're going to go head-to-head in January, and of course Bellator has actually a really good show that night with Bader against Fedor, so that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
maybe it doesn't fit the full scope of what under the radar means, but
Glad you're putting it in there.
Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz is 3 weeks away. Can you believe it's already
under the
3
radar?
weeks
Nobody's
away?
talking about it.
Yeah.
It's the names are under the radar, but the fact the fight is this close is under the radar because it has, in my opinion, zero buzz.
Isn't
Maybe
it
that
like-
will change.
It's like 2 days after Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
It's Thanksgiving weekend. It's at the Forum in Inglewood, California. I don't know how tickets are doing, but I think they were on sale this week. When I'm saying on sale, like there's a discount code for Halloween this week.
Yesterday, if you used the code TREAT.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. It's $50 on pay-per-view. We know that, but there hasn't been a whole lot of media done by either man. There hasn't been a real press conference in earnest outside of that weird one that was on the day of the Canelo Triple G weigh-ins.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a big media push for a fight that could have used a big media push to kind of make it a thing. To make it a
do they
big
finally
deal.
have the card? Because I know there's
The card has
different
changed
ones,
like
right?
3 or 4 times. It'll probably change again. It's not what MMA fans would be used to as far as what a loaded, a stacked card looks like. It's more of a boxing card where there's a few decent fights on the undercard, but really it's a one fight.
I think it's a major indictment of Golden Boy. Like, Showtime brought Deontay Wilder and what's his face? Tyson Fury bailed at the last minute, but they brought like Deontay. They brought Canelo to my show. I don't even cover boxing, and they brought them to my show just to get the name out there. And Golden Boy has been like not easy to work with in terms of the MMA side of things because I don't think they have people really on the job. I think they've taken them to like a couple of places, whereas Showtime is like hammering even for boxing. They want their MMA audiences. It's like a total contrast dealing with these promoters. It's a major indictment of them.
Well, what I'm concerned about is that Tito Ortiz said over the summer that the money that he was making from this fight was going to come almost solely from pay-per-view revenue and sales.
Yeah.
And it feels like they're not doing these guys a solid by promoting the fight. And then it makes me kind of wonder, Chuck and Tito, were they thinking, Chuck versus Tito is a big fight. It's they're two legends. They're Hall of Famers. They have that great rivalry. But this is not being pushed the way the UFC would have pushed it in their heyday. Maybe they were thinking like, all right, yeah, of course that fight's going to do big numbers. If thinking of the big UFC marketing push they used to have, and now there has been no marketing push with Golden Boy at all.
Danny, under the radar.
Are you ready for this?
Oh, let's hear it.
My under the radar is about the Zone. They picked up Road FC.
Good call. Good call.
You were just
Very good
talking
call.
to Martin Lewandowski on the MMA Hour, and I didn't know this, but on Monday I found that KSW is also on
the Zone.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
So
hey,
they
thanks for
got-
watching the MMA Hour, Dick.
He tunes in every Monday.
I'm teasing.
So anyway, they got Combate Americas, they got Bellator, Road FC, KSW, right?
They
I
have
don't know
one
what
more.
other MMA promotion
They have one more. I can't remember who it is, but yes.
But they're starting to pick up real estate, man, and it feels to me that they're picking up real estate.
Fight Nights Global. They have Fight Nights Global.
It's not only the UFC Fight Pass. What they did was get a bunch of promotions within the US. These guys are getting promotions all over the world that target different markets. And all of a sudden, with Canelo, signing the deal, all of a sudden the Zone, right? The Zone platform is becoming like a very solid combat sports package.
They're going all in quickly, man.
Dude, they're spending money.
They are.
They are not afraid to spend some money. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
They got to get some pro wrestling on there next, I think.
You know what? I actually agree.
Yeah, they got
pro wrestling's
pro
hot,
wrestling.
and as I understand it, isn't like the independent scene in pro wrestling,
Hottest it's ever been.
right? So,
It's red hot.
do you think it would meaningfully? I mean, I don't know how big the other company are. They big? Like, what would you put on there?
There are,
Wait, but do they stop becoming indie if they go big?
indie is kind of a catch-all term for non-WWE.
Okay.
Although
but
I disagree with that. But
Very quickly, are there promotions or orgs or whatever that are big enough to merit some kind of DAZN money?
certainly Impact Wrestling. Ring of Honor is owned by Sinclair, so it already has kind of outlets to put their stuff on. New Japan Pro Wrestling.
Oh,
is a
right.
possibility.
John Snowden won't stop tweeting about it. Yeah.
There's a ton of and there are even smaller indies that run a lot on like Fight TV has a bunch of indies that run like shows on there like for like a $10.99 $9.99 or $20 and yeah, I mean, all those are good. There's a lot of good wrestling out there right now.
All right, I have two quick under the radars. Number one, it was announced this week. I saw it in the Hollywood Reporter. Kevin Kay, the former head of Spike TV, the former head of Paramount Network, not just that, I think he was the head of TV Land and Nickelodeon as well at various points, was let go from the company. Cannot possibly overstate how big this is. The guy who was part of the team that greenlit Spike having the UFC, was instrumental in bringing Bellator into the Viacom family. Remember, they brought in PBC to Spike. They tried to give Glory a run. This was a champion of combat sports in that organization more than anybody else, and he is gone. I think that has major implications for the future. And he was also somebody that was really good to me in my career. You only need a few people in this world to take your back, and you can do some things. And I believe he did that. So that's the first one. The other one I would say is, here's what's interesting about things. Marvin Vittori announced on Instagram this week, reading a statement, almost like he was like an ISIS prisoner, but he was reading the statement.
Oh my God.
Okay, maybe it was inelegant the way he did it, but here's what I have noticed with Sean O'Malley on his own terms announcing the suspension, with guys like Marvin Vittori announcing on his own terms the announcement of the suspension. I have noticed it has had much less impact, much less negativity. I thank the UFC for changing this policy. You need a policy, and I don't know if Marvin Vittori is innocent. I don't know if Sugar Sean's innocent. I suspect that at least one of the two is, maybe both. I don't know. Here's what I do know, that there are going to be innocent people caught up in a hard-nosed kind of anti-doping policy. You need a system that protects them. This does much better job to protect their reputations. It's just coming in one ear and out the other. And for someone who's going to be gone 2 years, well, then they have to pay that cost. But at least if they're innocent, they don't have to get dragged through the mud. They get to hand this out on their own terms. This is such a great improvement. I am very happy to see it. Anything else, boys?
Kevin Kay also brought pro wrestling to Spike TV.
You know what, Kevin? Glad you're gone. I'm teasing. I'm teasing. All right. You know, we have so much work to do. Media Day is today. Weigh-ins tomorrow. Fights on Saturday. So it's still a big week here in New York City. Just don't know if it's the biggest week it could have been, but we're still on board. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember, we got tons of content, and I do mean a metric ton, coming to you with all of the interviews we're going to have and all the weigh-in stuff and all the Fight Night stuff. So keep it locked to MMA Fighting, and we always appreciate it when you do. All right, for Chuck, for Danny, I skipped one. For Mark, I'm teasing.
You forget my name, Luke?
For a second, I literally did. I am so tired. All right, for Ramundi.
No respect.
For, what's his name again? For Mark. For Danny, I'm Luke. Until next time, hands up, chin down, let him fly. This is the MMA Beat.